So it's been a while since we've done a general update of the Russo-Ukraine war, and by that I mean not just talking about a particular aspect of it or what's going on a particular day, but where we are with the whole conflict. In terms of military, economic, geopolitical, diplomatic, all that stuff. So we're going to go through this, but I might not go into as much detail about specifics as I sometimes do. So, with regards to the military situation, I think I was largely correct in saying that Ukraine's spring summer fall offensive last year basically destroyed any strategic initiative Ukraine had left, and they no longer have the ability to launch major offensives. For those of you who don't recall, Ukraine had announced several months in advance and released multiple movie trailers that they were going to launch this big offensive that was going to go all the way down to the Sea of Azov and split the Russian army in half and maybe cause the Russians to lose the war. The Russians knew about this and had built massive defense lines. I'm not sure if Ukraine, even in most places, reached the first line. It was essentially a total disaster, and artillery, missiles, drones, and minefields wound up wiping out. It might have been most of their armored vehicles and most of their ammunition. So they permanently lost their strategic initiative, and they can't, in my opinion at least, launch anything even remotely close to the Kharkov offensive of the first year of the war or the spring, summer, fall offensive of last year. So what's followed that is the Russian war machine is gradually picking up steam. They've been pushing ever since then, but it's getting more and more intense as time goes on. Russia seems to be acting very cautiously. They aren't making really any big aero offensives. They're just kind of creeping forward, relying on the fact that they have overwhelming firepower, air power, manpower, however you want to describe it. They don't really see a point in launching too many full frontal assaults into well-defended positions. Because that's the thing. And people will say, well, Argent, the Russians are still taking a lot of casualties. Why do you say that they're winning? And I mean, Russia's always going to be taking significant casualties because the Ukrainians still have a large army. They still have guns. They still have tanks. They still have artillery. And they're in defensive positions. And no matter how much of like a firepower advantage Russia has, you're always going to take casualties if you're attacking fortified positions. As I've said many times, the Ukrainian army has displayed heroic courage and resilience while having to deal with Zelensky and Blinken and all those tools. Now, I said that I thought the war had entered its final military phase with the fall of Avdiivka, which was the biggest fortress city that was left between Donbass and the Dnieper. And we talked about this, that there wasn't a ton of fortifications past it. There's a couple more fortified cities that are under attack at the moment, but nothing anywhere of the scale of Avdiivka. And I remember at the time, the Ukrainians were committing the last of their strategic reserves. That is, the last people who were arrested, the last people who were held back, their last kind of veteran troops were thrown in there. And that whole thing was a disaster. They held for quite a while, but because they refused to withdraw, a lot of people got captured or killed. A lot of the troops just retreated without any kind of organization. There was just a complete and total rout. The reinforcements that they sent in got slaughtered, trying to hold the salient open long enough. And just all along the front, Russia's pushing everywhere. They're trying to encircle a lot of these fortress settlements rather than assault them directly, because at this point in time, they have all the time in the world. Ukraine can't launch major offensives. They can launch local ones sometimes or counterattacks, but the world is basically their oyster. It's very much in their hands. Now, I've made periodic predictions as to when Russia was going to launch like their big Arrow YOLO offensive, when they were going to try to bring the war to the end. But I've kind of come to the conclusion that that's just maybe not going to happen. The Russians are operating on their own timetable. They have their own plan. It seems to me like Putin's largely left the conduct of the war up to the general staff. and it's not primarily dictated by the political whims of the moment. They have their plan, and they're just going to keep doing it regardless of what America does, what Ukraine does, and anyone else does. And that makes it very hard to kind of predict what's going to happen, because the Russian military has quite good OPSEC in that they don't really announce things. They don't even announce they've captured positions until several days after they capture them. They don't announce where offensives are going to go, and just a lot of stuff. It's very opaque. And they also put out a lot of misinformation. So, as to what the Russians' plan is, I think by and large the plan is to just keep doing what they're doing. They're getting, as far as I can determine, a very good kill-to-death ratio against the Ukrainian army. If you follow the reports at all, they're destroying more artillery, more anti-air defenses, more of Ukraine's heavy equipment by the day. I think in July, I believe this was Reuters, but I could be wrong, they claimed that Ukraine had taken about 60,000 casualties, whereas forced conscription and mobilization efforts only provide about 30,000 a month. Russia's economy is doing quite well. Military production continues to increase. They're buying stuff from North Korea and Iran now. There's still, I believe the claim is that about 1,000 people enlist. A day or so, the Russian government has had successful recruitment campaigns, and they dramatically increased the amount of pay and benefits soldiers received. So a lot of people are jumping in. Also, now that it looks like the war's win is going very strongly in Russia's favor, why not jump in? You'll have a story to tell your grandkids. Well, the war is causing some labor shortages, generally speaking, because of the way their military industrial complex is set up and the way their budget works. From everything I've seen, Russia isn't really running up a significant amount of debt to finance this war. So they're getting stronger basically every day, whereas Ukraine's getting weaker pretty much every day. And who really knows when which side is going to collapse? We've gotten some early reports off and on that there are Ukrainian units that retreat without orders. There's units that refuse to attack Russian positions, that morale is really low, that there's been riots, attacks against the conscription forces, and things like that. Now, I don't know how widespread it is. I don't think it's at a critical point yet, but it does seem to gradually be getting worse. And part of me feels like things are going to be bad until they're catastrophic. That is, they're going to keep kind of getting pushed back. It's going to keep being a mess until inevitably the Ukrainian army just breaks and collapses and flees. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's kind of the impression I get. And I think that's what Russia is doing, is they're gradually increasing the pressure until it eventually snaps. And so this brings us to Ukraine's allies, because at this point in time, their defense industry has been destroyed, and they're entirely dependent upon resources sent from the West, particularly Germany, the UK, and America. Now, Germany recently announced that military aid is being halved this year. Sorry, I'm not sure if it's this year or in 2025, but Germany's basically said that they're out of equipment that they can send to Ukraine, and that whatever they're going to give them at this point is just going to be a trickle, and it's going to come out of monthly production as opposed to reserves. Similarly, the US has gone through most of its stockpiles, and really all they have left is to give them whatever comes out of their monthly production. Now, Reuters put out an article that I covered on this channel a couple weeks back that talked about how bad the TNT production and gunpowder production situation was. And it was completely nuts. It was something like there was only one TNT factory, and it was in Poland. And it was this sketchy, like, one that was out of date and was being run overtime and could blow at any given moment. And that there's so many supply bottlenecks that the U.S. isn't capable of increasing shell production too much, just because they don't have the TNT or the gunpowder or the other chemicals required for increasing it. So even if they had a bunch of shell factories ready to go, they don't have the raw materials to increase it. And I'm sure there's ways around this, but it's not going to be done in the next year or two. So all Ukraine really gets at this point is a trickle. I think similarly, there's not really a way for them to scale up interceptor missile production in any kind of timely fashion. They did pass the $61 billion and all that money went to Ukraine, but most of it actually just went to the MIC to build stuff that might reach Ukraine in like 5 to 10 years when this war is completely and totally over. And once again, it's a bit like that scene 28 Days Later where they get a whole bunch of stuff from a grocery store and then they jokingly throw their credit cards onto the counter because what use do you have for money if there's no one to buy from and there's no one to sell to? It just kind of doesn't have a point at that point in time. Even if the U.S., regardless of how much money the U.S. and Britain and Germany and etc. put into this whole thing, there's just not enough stuff for them to buy and send to Ukraine. We had the Czechs try to come up with this like 40 chess plan to buy shells from the international arms market from like shady people in Africa, and that didn't produce very many, and a lot of those were defective. So even if you go and try to like purchase them in a semi-legal form, there just isn't enough. So all of this stuff is going bad, and Russia's inevitably going to win. We just don't really know when yet. It could be next month, it could be next year. Now, the prediction I had made was that Zelensky or whoever would succeed him would begin negotiations starting in the summer of 2024. Now, there's still a bit of the summer left, but admittedly, I thought that they were going to be started by now, so I'm probably largely wrong on that. There, however, has been some of the first rumblings within Ukraine that Zelensky might be willing to consider negotiations and might be willing to make some sort of compromises. Now, for the longest time, we had the Zelensky plan or the Zelensky peace formula, which basically was Russia's unconditional surrender. It was Russia would withdraw from all occupied territory, including Crimea. Putin would be charged for war crimes. I forget if Russia was going to be like demilitarized or something like that, and they were going to pay war reparations and all this just stuff. It was basically, like I said, Russia's unconditional surrender was what the Zelensky program was. And they've held to that very strongly for the last couple of years. And we've had a number of peace conferences, but generally speaking, what the peace conferences are is NATO and friends meet. They don't let Russia attend, and then they come up with like a peace offering. They come up with a peace treaty that they like agree to themselves, and then that's the plan, I guess. They expect Russia to just accept it. There's a lot of arrogance in being high off your own supply when you're dealing with the US and NATO and Ukraine, wherein they think if they just tell Russia how they want the war to end, Russia will just do it. They don't really seem to understand that Russia has its own agency, its own plans, and they're not going to do something just because the U.S. tells them to do it. I honestly don't know what the point of these conferences are, if it's just media, if they actually believe it. One of the trademarks, I think, of this entire conflict is it's very hard, at least for me, to tell what's delusion, what's PR, what's incompetence, what's just trying to buy time. So I can never really tell how much they believe their own nonsense or not. But Zelensky has recently stated that he's open to negotiations that will result in Ukraine not immediately getting back all of the territory it's lost. And this is something you've started to see earlier this year, that the U.S. government has started to suggest we need to have a freeze in the conflict, like North Korea, wherein Russia just agrees to hold the current territory they have in legal limbo. It's still recognized as part of Ukraine, but it's de facto under Russian control. And the conflict just stops, and then Ukraine joins NATO. And that is the plan that they continue to put forward. Russia has no interest in this whatsoever. But this seems to be what Zelensky is coming to the conclusion of, is that the end of the war will be the frontline freezes, where it is. The territory is still legally part of Ukraine to be returned at a future date, and Ukraine will be allowed to join NATO. Now, Russia has presented their own peace terms, which are basically building on what they offered at the beginning of the war. So the terms Russia has offered is the 4 regions that they have annexed, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, as well as obviously Crimea, are going to be ceded to Russia as per treaty, as per the principle of international self-determination. These will become a permanent part of Russia. They will not be occupied territories. They will be internationally legally recognized as part of Russia. Secondly, the Ukrainian government will repress or remove the various ultra-nationalist groups. There will be protections for Russian speakers within Ukraine, and Ukraine will agree to never join NATO. Now, you may have noticed something that these two things are not anywhere near being able to make something resembling an agreement. NATO membership is, in my view, it's something that the West will never give up on, that Ukraine has to be allowed to join NATO, and Russia will never let Ukraine join NATO. So as long as the decision can't be made on that, this war can't end. And Russia had said that that is the last terms we're offering, and then after that, we're going to demand unconditional surrender, and terms will be dictated. Once the government has collapsed, it is no longer capable of resistance. So like I said, I don't think that the Western countries will ever accept. I think they'd rather fight to the last Ukrainian. I think they'd rather host a government in exile than give up on NATO membership for Ukraine, but I could be wrong. I think part of the reason they're saying we're willing to start negotiating is there is this hope that if they can get Russia into negotiations, they can try to get a temporary ceasefire. And this will give Ukraine some much needed breathing room. Part of the issue they're facing is whenever they mobilize or conscript new soldiers, they don't have almost any time to train them. So a ceasefire for a couple of months would give them time to train their guys up, get some of their convalescent soldiers back to the front line, rebuild some defense lines. The West could ship them in some more stuff. Really, at this point in time, any kind of freeze would help Ukraine much more than Russia, who's just putting constant pressure on them, and the pressure is growing by the day. So I think that's part of it, is that this idea of negotiations isn't in good faith. It's to try to trick Russia into pausing long enough for them to get Ukraine back so it can continue fighting. I think also there is some acknowledgement both within Ukraine and within NATO that this war is lost, but we have to keep it going until November. Because if it fails while Biden's still president, it's going to help Trump out a lot, and it's going to, if not guarantee him the victory, it's going to dramatically improve his chances. Also, now that Biden is not running again, if it collapses after Biden leaves office, then well, it's his fault. It's not Kamala Harris's fault. She had no involvement with the American government during the entirety of their support of the Ukrainians. However, once again, like, the Russians aren't stupid. It's once again, if you enter like a conflict thinking your opponent is incapable of anything, like that they're retarded, that's not where you want to be. The Russians, as I said many times, miscalculated a lot, particularly in the early part of this war. But they're not dumb. Putin's not dumb. The general staff isn't dumb. Their intelligence agencies aren't dumb. They like can see this lame attempt at a trick, at gaslighting from a mile away, and they've said even if we have negotiations, we're not going to stop. We're going to keep advancing to continue to put pressure. We're not going to do these negotiations and give you a chance to do all the stuff that I just said and rebuild the front line. Once again, a lot of this is reminiscent of the Paris peace process towards the end of the Vietnam War, wherein while negotiations were going on, the North Vietnamese continued their offensive and didn't let the South Vietnamese rebuild or reorganize or get into a better position. If anything, their constant advances helped with the negotiations because they kept being able to demand more and more. And I think likewise, Russia will do that. I think Russia also just thinks all these people are clowns at this point in time. And there's no real, they have zero trust that anything will be decided upon, if there is an agreement, if it's going to be held to at all. So they're just like, sure, we'll have negotiations, we'll have mediation, we'll do that. But they know it's not going to go anywhere, so they'll do that. But then they'll keep pushing and try to collapse Ukraine anyways, because if they stop, Ukraine will join NATO, and they don't want to fight NATO because NATO has nuclear weapons. The other thing that's kind of reminiscent of the end of the Vietnam War is the lack of authority in Washington. Now, if I recall, towards the end of the Vietnam War, we had the whole thing with Nixon resigning and Watergate and all that mess, and that really prevented the U.S. from doing anything. I think Nixon was at least somewhat willing to provide some additional air power or ammunition or oil or something like that to try to prevent the collapse of South Vietnam. But he wasn't really able to do anything because all the Watergate stuff was happening. And it's very much like that at the moment, wherein the U.S. government is in a state of total chaos. No one knows who's running anything. I've mentioned this many times, but I keep bringing it up. Is Biden? Is Blinken? Is Kamala? Is Obama? Is Hillary? No one really knows who's even running stuff at this point in time. If someone was going to negotiate with Putin, who would even negotiate with Putin? Would it be Obama? Would it be Blinken? Would it be Biden? I don't even know. And I don't think the Russians know either. And I think at a certain point, they just don't care. I think they're just like, these guys don't have their shit together. They're never going to have their shit together. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. If they try to pull something, okay, we'll deal with it then. But in the meantime, we're just going to ignore the noise. We're going to ignore the fluff. We're going to ignore the Western media. And we're going to keep pushing until we've achieved the objectives of the special military operation. So yes, while I was wrong that Ukraine was going to start surrender negotiations by the summer, although who knows, there's still a month left. It still could happen. At the very least, they've started to consider unfavorable peace terms. More so than me saying that Ukraine was going to surrender, I meant that they were going to accept peace terms that did not get everything they wanted. That would require them to give something up and would not be entirely favorable to them. But some Russian generals are saying this war is going to be over by the end of the year. Once again, by war, it depends how one defines the war. If we're going to count the formal surrender of Ukraine, I don't know what that even would look like. If that means Ukraine's going to accept an unfavorable truce, if the Ukrainian government and army is going to collapse. Because you could argue if Ukraine becomes a government in exile, then the war never ends in a certain regard, or if there's a lot of guerrilla activity. I don't think Russia is really interested in taking a lot of the areas that would more actively resist them. They're going to have to figure something out, though. And to kind of just conclude with my personal opinion on the whole thing, I really think Ukraine should just take the deal Russia's offering them. They're not going to get anything better. The only thing they really lose is the parts of the oblasts that Russia claims that are still in their hands. They'll lose Kherson, they'll lose Zaporozhye, and they'll lose what's left of the two Donbass republics that are in their hands. But it looks like that will not include Odessa, that will not include Kharkov, that'll not include Kiev or Sumy or any of those regions, and you can still have a viable, if diminished, Ukrainian state at this point in time. But if they're going to keep fighting indefinitely, they're going to keep going through it, then that offer is just not going to be on the table in, I don't know, weeks or months or whatever. The sticking point is NATO membership. It looks like Ukraine will never give up on that, and their backers will never give up on that, and neither will Russia. So I don't really see, even if territorial situation could be agreed upon, I don't think the war can end at any point in time in this foreseeable future, given the NATO question. So I guess as we continue with the end game or the final phase of this war, the question is how desperate is the West going to get? Are they just going to slowly back off? Like I said, America is in a state of complete chaos and confusion. I don't know how much they could really do, even if they wanted to more directly intervene or send an expeditionary force or something like that, because of just how much of a total mess the whole stuff is. So that's kind of an overview of where we're at the moment. Russia continuing to advance. We're in, I believe, the last phase of the war. Whether this phase lasts a month or 6 months or even a year, I'm not sure. I would tend to think probably the Ukrainian army will collapse by the end of the year, given the current rate. But we have to be very careful because the Russians aren't operating under any particular timetable that we know of, at least. I don't know if they even really care what happens with the American election. So I doubt they're even, because you could argue if they push now and they inflicted some big defeats, it would help Trump. But I don't know if they even really care, or they don't think it's worthwhile to care. And so, like I said, that's the state of the war. I'll do more updates as they become available. I just thought it would be a good idea to give a general update of where the war's at. God bless everybody. Have a great day and have a great weekend.